Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Working Process. Today, I am in conversation with Patrice Renee Washington, whose work I first encountered last summer, July 2024, at her exhibition Tendril, which was up at the ICA in Richmond, while I was there doing a residency. And I was so struck by the vessels and works themselves, and how Patrice weaves together culture and identity and symbols of the two, where they come from, what they mean, and how they persist. So we're talking about that today. We're talking about Tendril. We're talking about cultural symbols and identity. We're talking about Patrice's research practice, reclamation, history, and a whole bunch of other good stuff. So I hope that you will enjoy this one. And here we go. Welcome to Working Process, conversations with Black women working in, with, and around clay about their work and process. An audio offering by writer and ceramicist Gabrielle Ione Hickman. Hey everybody, welcome back to Working Process. I'm here today with Patrice Renee Washington, whose work I first encountered in her solo show Tendril, which was up at the ICA at VCU this summer. And that was when I knew that I wanted to speak with her on the show. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. Welcome, Patrice, and I'll let you just tell folks a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, my name is Patrice. I'm an artist that works primarily in sculptural ceramics. Also an educator here in New York. And I come from kind of a very multi-material sculpture background. I kind of found my way to ceramics. And so I'm excited to kind of talk more.
Yay. So just to kind of like ease us in, I would love to know, what's your favorite clay body? And then I know from seeing your work that you use a lot of like glaze. So if you have a favorite glaze, and then what's your favorite like tool?
Yeah, my favorite clay body has not changed for quite a while. It's a dark red cone 6 clay body that I actually started using when I was in grad school. And it has just really stuck with me. Something about that way that clay body fires, just like a really, really dark brown with no glaze, that I've just have always been, I don't know, enthralled by. And let's see, favorite glaze. Well, for my show at ICA, I was working a lot with low fire for a lot of the larger sculptural works. And I'm like a big fan of like taking commercial glazes, using, I think it's Elements. I think it's maybe Mako, and doing like lots of different like layering tests with them. And that was kind of an endless world. I like absolutely hate making my own glazes. I'm just going to be.
I was going to ask you if you were making your own.
I'm not a fan, but I like to like hack the commercial stuff. And so I'm really kind of vibing on just like 1,000 different color combinations with just layering things. And my favorite tool, I love that you asked that question, because I remember ordering a bunch of stuff from Ceramic Supply, which is located, I think, in New Jersey. And they sent me a bunch of tools, and I got this tool that I absolutely did not order, but kind of fell in love with. And it's like a blade, maybe like 1.5 inches long, kind of like triangle, like cutout shape. And I use this thing like constantly. It's like my security blanket. So if I'm ever working and I like can't find it, I'm like, oh my God, frantic, and like nothing else does.
Yeah.
That is my tool. I should probably get another one just for, safety's sake, but.
Yeah, just in case. But I feel like we all have, I mean, even hearing you sort of talk about this, right? Like the clay body that you've stuck with since grad school, like the tool that you're, sort of very like attached to. I feel like we all have those things, and they become like hallmarks of not only like our time in the studio, but also our work. And so in that same vein, I'm curious if there's something that you're like always like listening to or can hear when you're in the studio, because I think that plays a big factor in like the making process as well. Like I have this playlist that I like always listen to. And so I'm curious, like, what that might be for you.
Yeah. So, I didn't think too deeply about it. But now I'm like, there are different things. Like I favor music when I am like beginning something, like I'm starting something up. So I like to listen to like Janelle Monáe. I like Eric Badu. I listen to the same thing over and over again. I'm like not a new music person. So I'm just like, oh yeah, that came out in the 90s or like late 2000s. Okay, great. So I listen to that as I'm getting started. It has like kind of good energy. And I think that when I'm kind of doing like more detailed work, kind of doing the same like repetitive movements over and over, I more so favor either podcasts or I like recently discovered audiobooks and it's completely changed me. So there's just something like really soothing about having someone else talk to me and like feeling like I'm part of the club. But for podcasts, I love The Read is really great. I do Maintenance Phase, If Books Could Kill, and audiobooks. I'm currently listening to the Little Women audiobook, which is like 20 hours long. But you know, a classic. But yeah, it's really important for me to like have something going on in the studio, and it really needs to like match my mood and my vibe because it'll really dictate the way that I'm working. Super important.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I feel like for me, I listen to podcasts on the way to the studio. And then when I'm like actually, and you know, when I'm like getting things set up, you know, putting my drink down, stuff like that. But then once I'm like actually starting to work on a piece, I have to put on like my jazz playlist. And then if I'm doing like burnishing or something that kind of is like repetitive, then I'm either like going for like a podcast or a TV show or something. So kind of similar there, which is cool.
Interesting. Yeah. It's like, and I'm also thinking about like when I'm glazing, I don't think I listen to anything because it's like,
well, you have to be so focused. Yeah.
No. And it's interesting. Like, I feel like so much of it's subconscious of what we kind of go for. So it's super interesting to hear.
Okay, so can you tell us like a little bit just about your working process? I know you sort of primarily work between like coil and slab building. And so like, how do you decide when you're doing that? Like, do you sketch your pieces before you build them? Yeah, just like, what's the vibe? Yeah.
It is like absolute chaos. Like I guess I don't know. And it's a great question because I don't know about a lot of other people's working processes, but for me, it's like, it's going to take me like a couple weeks to like think about, like an interesting, like new series. Like if I'm going to start a new series or something, I like to base it off of, you know, like some sort of research project in a way, or something I want to kind of delve into more. And so I really have to mull that over for a while. I like to kind of collect my resources. Sometimes that looks like sending myself emails throughout the day because I'm so old school, and kind of looking at those and then, you know, starting to make some sketches, like really loose sketches until something starts to stick. And I feel like the sketch really has to like grab me. Like I need to like make it like relatively detailed for it to really make sense. And then I like to, big fan of like kind of including dimensions, just like really specific. And then I always commit to either doing some sort of like small test or I don't know, kind of like dipping my feet in the water, especially if it's kind of like a new way of working. And usually that first piece that I make, I always just like absolutely hate it. And I have to just like immediately trash it. Or if it's like the first piece I make, like it will not see the light of day, like at an exhibition. And that's just like a consistent thing for me. If it's also like a safety blanket or something, I need to just like make that whole first piece and just despise it. But it's like a real learning process. And so it makes me think of like when I first started the vessels that you saw in the show, the kind of the braided vessels. When I started that work, it was like very new and very different from what I had done before. So I remember I really labored over this first initial piece and I was like, this isn't it. This is like so not it. Like I can't even like go through raising it. But that really helps me work out the kinks. Like, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to coil build like this element, and like that just doesn't work for it. And so then I can like learn and understand that I need to pivot, and the forms kind of respond a little bit better. But yeah, that testing process is like so important. It's so important because you're dedicating time, especially with ceramics. It's like you're working and and everything can fall apart at the last minute. And you're just like, oh my God.
And that does happen. That happened to me very, very recently. And it was very much devastating. Very much devastating. I'm so curious, like, about this sort of testing process. Are you building the full size? Is it like a smaller sort of maquette? And then like it's in, right, the sort of final clay body, you're right, sort of adding those elements? Because so my thing too, when I was at the show, because I also work with clay, I was getting like as close as possible without actually, touching the pieces. Because I was like, I'm always so fascinated to see like how are other people, right, building their pieces. And so then I was like, oh, she's probably braiding this and then, attaching it. And you don't have to go right into all of that because that's, your secret sauce. But just in terms of like this testing process, right? Are you building at the full scale? Are you doing a smaller size? Are you adding in all of the sort of elements that you've like outlined on your notebook? And then like, are you sort of glazing it in what you think you might like? Is it a whole thing or is it just the like build sort of itself?
Well, I've never really forced myself to make like a small maquette. Because I think like secretly in my mind, I'm like, what if the first piece ends up being really good? Maybe I should just go into it, even though I know damn well I'm going to hate it. But like, I always have to be like, if I'm going to take like my really small, precious chunk of time, I'm just going to start it. And like, that's going to be the test piece. And I usually do it like full size, full scale, in the clay body, kind of like with full intentions. And then it just like never works out. But it is important, I think, to use like all of the intended materials because I can see how things will really react even in that first firing, because I feel like so much of like those pieces in particular are like weight bearing and there's kind of a lot of gravity impending on them. So if I can see like, okay, these are going to be weak spots, this is going to be harder to pull off with like a larger work. If I have like overhangs, it just becomes like a really great way to kind of test out all those kind of weird finicky things. But I usually like don't take it to the glazing stage. So,
so just like the piece itself. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll biscuit and I'll be like, okay, I hate it too much to use glaze on this.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. I have toyed with sort of making maquettes, or trying things, but I tend to worry that like, for me, sometimes not sometimes, right? Each piece is so different. Mm-hmm. And so it probably would be a good exercise to like sort of do the test and then, right, then make the test again. But there's something sometimes that's very like intuitive. So then I sort of, I'm like, okay, well, like it wouldn't be exactly the same piece, even if I did make it again. And so then I kind of sit, back and forth between that. And I've also just, I don't know, learned to like, I feel like ceramics teaches you so much about like detachment as well. So I'm like, well, if it blows up, like it blows up and I'll make something else. But I really admire that sort of like testing piece of your process.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point too. Like, I think that, with me too, like each piece is like this unique object. And I think that if I made the object in like a small kind of tiny version, I feel like there's a big part of me that just like would not let me remake it again in this exact way, because there's like, I feel like each piece has its own like kind of energy to it. And it's like, once you put it out once, either it like has to change in the next manifestation or like something has to kind of go down. So yeah, I like that you brought that up.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we sort of know like a little bit about your working process, what you're listening to, your sort of favorite clay tool, all of that, can you just tell us like, how did you first come to clay, like as a sort of material, as a medium? And like, at what point were you like, yeah, like I'm here, I'm hooked, I'm sort of committed to this, even as you maybe, work in other mediums as well?
Yeah. I feel like it's such an interesting, story for me personally. So like I took ceramics in undergrad, and I just like hated it. I hated. I really did not enjoy the teacher. I hated the projects and the material. I was done with it, and I was way more interested in more sculptural elements. But then when I went to grad school at Columbia, I took a class with artist and professor named JJ Pete. And the way that he taught ceramics was like really super different. And it just like totally grabbed me because it was like a way into the medium that wasn't like steeped in so much history, I guess. It was like, this is just like another, medium. It's like you have wood, there's clay, there's metal, like let's figure out ways to like make things stick together. And it was way more kind of conceptually driven. And that's when it started to kind of grab me. And also just knowing that like it's just like a piece of kind of very malleable goo that you can kind of make anything with. And I think that freedom, it's like I wasn't like buying, a 2x4 and trying to figure out how to manipulate that. It's like I could just start manipulating. And that was like, it really spoke to me. And also it was like, I was just like broke in grad school and, the clay was supplied, the kilns were running, and I was like, this is probably the most economical way I can even like make work here. Which changes once you're out of the institution. But I think like those things kind of put together really kind of hooked me for life. And I also like created like a small kind of community in the ceramic studio there, which was like a very, very bare bones kind of ceramic space. Like just there were like kilns and tables and like some commercial clays. There was not much going on there. But I mean, it's the best material. What can I say?
And the rest is history. I really appreciate as well what you were saying about sort of clay, like especially in that space being accessible, because I think clay is one of the more accessible materials. And I really sort of also appreciate and take the point of like, you just have the brick or the ball or the whatever it is, and then you can go, right? Like it's almost more of a, what am I trying to say? Like you go like sort of like inside out versus outside in, where like, right, like having the wood block and then having to do that versus with clay, you just have the raw thing and then you turn it. And I agree that something sort of in that is really, really freeing. It's almost like a blank canvas, but it's a bit more easy to like mold and shape and work with.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm just reminiscing, just thinking about my clay as my lover right now. Yes, it's everything.
I mean, it's you have a relationship with it, right? Especially when you work with the same. Like I work with 2 clay bodies, right? So you get to know those clay bodies, and they get to know you as well. And it really is a relationship, which I'm sure every artist feels a relationship with their materials, but. I think there are a lot of ways that like we shape and we work with the clay, but like clay also shapes and works with us.
Of course. Yeah. It's like this relationship of response that I feel like is just so unique. It keeps your imprint. It's like so reciprocal.
Yeah. So I would love to hear as well about like how your heritage, where you're from, where you're based, any of those things, all of those things, right, sort of are in relationship with and impact your practice.
Yeah. So I think for me, like thinking about kind of the conceptual elements that are happening in my work, I think I've always looked towards understanding like larger cultural symbols for understanding parts of identity. So like me being biracial and like thinking about these markers or different elements that signify my identity to others, or maybe even like stereotypes or assumptions that may make about me through these like larger cultural symbols has always been like really interesting and like fascinating for me to kind of flesh out in my work. And so thinking about even themes like thinking about food that appear in my work, and thinking about how food has a relationship to, certain cultures, and like how certain foods get kind of adopted to them and kind of cradled by them. And so how do we take that as like a narrative jumping off point? So that's always been really kind of intriguing for me. And artwork has just really been a place for me to, just like figure myself out. I think it's been like my own kind of personal kind of therapy. And I come from a family of like very not artistic people. So, I feel like for so long they're just like, what the hell are you doing? And I think it's hard also if you're coming from, a family where, I mean, if you think about art, we think a lot about kind of like affluence and like the ability to be able to do art because we think about money making. So coming from a family that, does not have a ton of money, it seems like a really strange option. I think it can for like lots of people of color coming from places where, one might just be trying to like survive and like pay the bills. So yeah, that's kind of the background. And I think that it keeps changing as I get older too, the way that I understand it and the way that I understand my work, through who I am.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely this sort of myth or narrative about the starving artist, right? Like you can't be an artist, and artists struggle and all these different things. And I feel like that's very pervasive in general, but also sort of potentially in our communities, right? When we're having conversations with people, because, they just want us to be able to be taken care of. And sometimes it maybe doesn't feel like art is the vehicle for that. But I hope that like those conversations shift as we like continue to do our work and like continue to actually sort of like prove those narratives like wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's, a lot about being seen in these art spaces and like, the recognition of knowing that these people exist in your art spaces, in so many different facets. If it's galleries, if it's museums, and I think just even like the presence of being able to have like more people of color like in your art classes. I mean, it's like, so typical. I think when you're in school or like the art majors, there's maybe like one or two people of color that are also, looking into the art field. And it's tough. And even like thinking about professors and like just like seeing someone that looks like you, that's interested in that same field and can kind of cheer you on in a lot of ways, I think is really important.
Yeah, the sort of power of representation, which can also be detrimental at sometimes, right? Depending upon sort of how things go. But that sort of like segues really well into something that I wanted sort of to talk with you about because, I see in your work like such attention to the past, but also like the creation of new worlds. And so I'm thinking like specifically here about the ways that you're like both attending to and sort of like reclaiming, right? Like the watermelon or like fried chicken or the fried chicken shop. And then sort of like doing that through this reworking of, right, the sort of Dutch like Delftware tradition. But then you're also like building these new worlds through the creation of your inkieces, and sort of like right carrying that forward from West and Central Africa. And so I'm curious if you can speak to like this interplay between like past, present, and future, but also like you're also doing a lot of representation in your work. And so like how do you sort of think about those sort of representation, reclamation, past, present, future?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot going on simultaneously, and sometimes I'm like, what spot am I at right now in my brain? Like, what the hell's going on? But I think that, like I said earlier, like I've been like really interested in these symbols for kind of understanding culture at large, and I think that often grabbing those easily recognizable symbols that, viewers can understand as those markers of culture become like a really good entry point. So in Kisi's, I'm thinking about like seeing them like being sold on the street as like this kind of like African artifact, and like what we understand as being African. And so seeing that as in like a larger realm of like being in America and understanding it in that way. And so using that entry point to then rework how we might understand that object. So kind of combining that form with something like hair, which is kind of another symbol that we kind of understand, bringing those together, thinking about what the Inkisi actually means, kind of marrying those two and creating like a completely new object that we can understand our present, and in turn, like think about how that can change a future. So I feel like it's like working on these different levels of language. And it's often like me, kind of marrying these two ideas or two aesthetic traditions, like thinking about the Delftware and the watermelon. And I was reading like a lot of Black science fiction, like Octavia Butler, and K. Jemis, when I was like first kind of birthing these works. So I was really kind of invested in this like different future that we're trying to like parse out and understand in these different ways. So that really heavily influenced a lot of those works and a lot of those combinations. But I love this idea of like stumbling upon something that, I've never seen before, but feels like vaguely familiar, and trying to like work my way backwards from there. And I like viewers kind of feeling like a little bit on the outside and only being able to like kind of grab onto a few things that they recognize as familiar and try and piece it together. Yeah, I think there's kind of a lot of things operating.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely an experience that I had when I was at the show. When I walked in and I was okay, what are these vessels? And then I was like, oh wait, this is hair, and I this is a Bantu knot, right? And I was sort of catching different pieces of it. And then the tile, I'll have to put in like pictures or something for people to see, right? And then like the tiles were on the wall, and I just started, and then I sort of knew about the Nkisi tradition, and I was like, okay, like, like what is going on here? And we're sort of, right, we're interrogating and like reclaiming history, but also like carrying history and tradition forward. And I just think that sort of the interplay between those two is really beautiful in your work. And so you sort of talked about like, right, sort of creating new futures. And I'm curious of like, what spell are you casting, right? Or like, what are you like sending forward into the future with your artifacts? Like, what is that future, or what is that like imagined past world where you're building from?
Yeah, I think it's imagining a world of like significance, kind of representation, and also like maybe through that just like a sense of normalcy. I think a lot about, so for the Delftware pieces, there's like these small kind of paintings that kind of surround the borders. And with some of them, they feature kind of notable like Black figures like James Baldwin. I think Nina Simone is in there. I think there's like a Black Panther in there. But that's kind of really thinking about those traditional Delftware works, of like just people doing like very regular things. And I kind of like this idea of those people being, kind of just these regular markers of history, of like these significant people being like regular people that we are able to view in this artifact form, and that are represented, I guess nobly in a way. So thinking about creating a world where that is normalized and important. And I think, thinking about the vessels, a lot of those are about thinking like protections, kind of spirituality of Black women and Black hair, and kind of showing that sacredness in those forms. And, the embodiment of like what might be inside those forms that keeps them kind of so sacred. So thinking about, how that can be part of some sort of future, and how that is like very important and like something to keep safe. Yeah, I mean, it can happen, right? I think it can happen.
It can happen. And I think, right. So something else that sort of, I think I took away from the exhibition was that, right. It was very, almost like, I feel like if you know, right? Like, I feel like my experience moving through that exhibition would be totally different than someone of a different subject position because of the cultural background and knowledge that I'm bringing to like viewing your work. And so I'm sort of, I guess I would just love to hear you sort of speak about like making work that's very Black without like translation, or like without translating it, or like sort of catering to the white gaze, or like, Toni Morrison talks about it as like, she's claiming her center, right? Like she's making work for Black folks very intentionally, and she's not interested in, right, sort of doing that work of translation. And I would just love to hear about, because I think that you're doing that, and so I would just love to sort of hear about how you also sort of think about that in your work.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, the reality is we're just like always operating in like these white dominated spaces and gazes, just like on a daily basis. So I have like no qualms about making somebody feel like an outsider for, a few moments in their life. But it also goes back to like, being in school, being in undergrad and graduate school, and those spaces being, it's predominantly white. And the work that you're making is constantly like critiqued from that point of view. And I feel like for so long, my work was really like, it was just always asked to be like more abstracted and more abstracted, to where it wasn't really saying what I wanted to say. And I feel like in a lot of ways, like it was passing. It was passing into these spaces without actually talking about what I always wanted to talk about. And so I think a few years after graduating, I was like, I'm so sick of like doing this. Like, I'm so sick of this. This is just like making it like palatable. Like, I just want to make something that's like undeniably about what it's about. And I think like that first happened with a piece I did for Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And I made like, it was these reliefs of kind of like a barbershop poster of all of these different kind of profiles of Black men. And it was the first like figurative piece I ever made. And it was like, I felt like a weight just like lifted off my shoulders. Just like that whole world. And after that, I was just like, oh yeah, I just need to keep doing this. Like, this is what I actually like want to do. And like, great. It makes people like not sure how to talk about it. Perfect. Like, perfect. And the people that do get it, like, we are able to like really speak about the work and about what surrounds the work. And it just felt like a real kind of community, I think, when I was able to like get over that hurdle. And, I think the reality is that like a lot of work like that, a work that's like kind of blatantly about identity, parts of identity are not like easily shown in the same way. So we don't get to see them on a larger scale. But I think it's important. I think it's super important.
It definitely is. And I felt so seen when I was moving through Tendril. Like, I felt so seen in the room. And then it was interesting because I think I was one of the only, when I went, I caught it like right before it closed. And I was one of the only Black people in the gallery when I was in there. And I just was wondering, like, I felt so seen, but I was so curious, right, what other people might have been experiencing. But it was nice, right, to sort of be in that space and feel like, oh, I get it, I understand what is happening here. And also, right, sort of, and then to see you do it on that scale, both in terms of like the space the space of the like gallery, but also the size of the vessels, and just how the space was used. And then also like walking into the sort of second room that had the Black walls with all of the Bantu knots, like I felt very seen. So thank you for that, like offering. And sort of, right, speaking of like doing this on a sort of specific scale, and also to sort of circle back to what you were talking about around like Black hair is sacred, right? Like you're in Kisses, and I feel like I might still be pronouncing that wrong, but they're like very clearly right in conversation with like those from West and Central Africa, but they also felt like very diasporic, and maybe that's because the other ones that I've seen have been in museums, and I haven't necessarily seen someone like reimagine them, and so I'm really curious about right, and then obviously right, the purpose that they serve is like for energy work and like protection. And so, well, one, I was also wondering, like, did you put anything inside of them? Which, like, you don't have to speak to if you don't want to, but I'm sort of, and they also felt very feminine. And so I'm interested in, right, like, how are you thinking sort of about like diaspora, like spirituality or energy protection, and then also like Black womanhood and Black hair, and because all of those things were merging in those vessels. Yeah.
Well, I think like this act of braiding and tending to the hair, and like kind of the ritual that comes with it, and kind of this indoctrination of like, in a lot of ways, it's like spending time with one, like an extended period of time with one another, and that kind of creates community. And I really liked this idea of kind of bringing that to those works and thinking about how that community is bridged. You know, it's like, so those pieces, have a very specific history and coming from West Africa, and thinking about how actual bodies have been like, taken from Africa over to the US, and how those traditions, continued, and they still continued. And so I think there's something so beautiful that like, that can't be stopped or crushed. And I think that that's why I really wanted to kind of embed that within those works. And the original Nkisi's feel so male, they have
yes
they have such a male element, and like and thinking about them as like as a cultural symbol for understanding Africa feels like funny to me, because it's like, it's just like another way to like forget with like a feminine presence. So I just wanted to like, once again, like figure out a way to put that at the forefront. And it felt really kind of important for me, also for like my own personal feminine energy and understanding where I lie on that spectrum.
Yeah. And it's also interesting too, because so much of Black culture diasporically is so matriarchal. So it's interesting that, right, those objects, those vessels, not yours, but the ones that we were sort of prior speaking to, feel so masculine, because it's kind of like, where's the disconnect there? But then also, right, all of that art was looted and stolen and brought here as well. So right, it's clear seeing your work that you do a lot of research, and so I would love to hear about like your research process, and then also, right, are you researching and making at the same time, or do you do a bunch of research, kind of put it down, and then go and make your work?
The research part of it, it's funny. It's like, I feel like something will just grab me at like a weird moment. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. If it's like, commuting to like work or something, and I like see something on the train where I'm like, oh, like the architecture of that handlebar is like really specific. Like I'm kind of into that. So it's like me taking a photo of that. But I think I follow certain threads, and just like everyday kind of whatever, if it's errands or not, or something kind of strikes me. And then I kind of go down a rabbit hole. And that's kind of what happens with Nkisi's, and with the Delftware. Yeah, with the Delftware too. I think that I saw this like amazing archival photo of, just some sort of residence where someone was living, and all of the tiles were these Delftware tiles. And so
Mm-hmm.
many of them were, they were just depicting like, people, the Dutch doing some regular stuff. And I was like, oh my God, can you imagine if there was a room that just had like, different like, Black people just like doing everyday things. Like I can't even imagine it. So it became like my own kind of personal quest. But oftentimes I'll kind of research, kind of source a bunch of materials, save them in a folder, and then I'll start like getting to sketching. And then I kind of dabble back in and out, in and out. So it's still kind of like a chaotic process of kind of understanding, but it's really important to the work, and maybe like a relatively new way for me to work as of like the last, I want to say like 5 or 6 years. I never really used to work on very research based, but I find it really generative for just my own practice and like a way to kind of keep going within like just manipulating different parts of form and color while still exploring kind of the same concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really like grounds the work. And also, I think, at least for me, like really came through as a viewer of your work, kind of some of the traditions and things that you were engaged with and like interrogating. So I would also love to like, we've talked about sort of women, and I would love to hear about like how you're thinking about your relationship or like sort of lineage, right, in sort of clay. In relation to all of the women who have like worked with clay before you and who will work with clay after you.
Yeah. Um, it's like kind of interesting because I feel like such an outsider with clay because of the way that I like kind of came to learn it. And like, since it wasn't steeped in like a ton of history, and it was just like, it always just felt like something that was happening on the side of like people that were really dedicated to clay, that I never felt like fully, you know, part of that community. So I feel like I didn't really know that many people working with clay. I didn't know a big part of that of community. So it's been like me just trying to find people in the past that have worked with it, and some of that has happened through research. I was actually just looking at these artifacts. I think it was from like maybe it was like 18th century. And it was from, what was it from? Maybe it was West Africa. Maybe it was Ghana, present day Ghana. And it was about these women that would make these like ceramic busts of the rulers that had died, these female rulers. And so they were the makers of them, and they'd be buried kind of in these different tombs with the dead. And so when they unearthed these, they found that it was like very interesting that there were actual like female makers of these objects, which is like kind of not usually, I guess, the case. But they were kind of these beautiful bust forms that had like really actually like ornate hair with them. And so just kind of understanding even like that lineage and like having that credit like attributed to them historically, I felt like was really important. And I think for like the future, like I said, I'm a teacher now. I teach ceramics, and I feel like, I didn't have like a huge community in ceramics, but I really want to give my students that, and I want to try and like the best way that I can. So I think that's kind of a big thing on my plate now. It's like how to make it an inviting, accepting space, and kind of like mimicking like my own entry point. I felt like very kind of unjudged in the ceramic studio when I first started. And I just really want to create kind of that space of ease and inclusivity for future makers so that they kind of stick with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I do feel like people who work with clay often are some of the best people. And I don't know, maybe that just comes from spending a lot of time with the material, or like I said, like, the ways that you have to like learn about detachment when you work with this. But I love sort of the like exploration of sort of like women's or Black women's sort of ceramic past, and also like the creation of sort of inviting and inclusive ceramic futures for folks. So to sort of like wind us down, right? Even sort of what you were just talking about with these vessels that were, you know, dug up, right? Like ceramics, they have real longevity. Like, you know, they last for centuries, if not like millennia of years. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering sort of like what you hope to leave behind, but also I think too, like given what we were saying about sort of how your work is building new futures in the present, like what are you leaving behind, right? Sort of through the creation of these artifacts. And yeah, like what, right? That world that you said is possible, like what does it sort of look like, and how do you see your work maybe helping to build it, I guess?
Yeah. You know, the fact that ceramics can be around for so long has like haunted my practice in ways that I cannot begin to explain to you. It's like held me from like experimenting with so much stuff where I'm like, you know what, I'm going to commit this idea to paper because I don't want to like leave this on the earth, which is also what makes the material so great because it's like so monumentalizing.
Yeah.
But it's like a tough part of it. But I feel like what I want to leave behind, I think not everything may be like understood in the context in which I created it in. You know, a lot of my things are dealing with like contemporary fast food chains that may not make sense in 300 years, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
But I think that if viewers can at least get some sort of like pleasure from the texture or the tactility or like the finish or the gleam, that like my job is done. You know, it's like, I feel like whenever I'm making work, I just really want it to like ask to be touched. It's like just kind of the very kind of aesthetic mode of it. It's really important for me to be like tempted to like touch something and feel something. So that's always in my head when I'm making works, and I always want viewers to like imagine what it might feel like, you know, on their hands if they would feel it. So maybe like, you know, years from now, I just want people to just like feel up on my works and feel really nice about that.
Yeah. But I think that they might also be, right, this invitation to look into sort of, right, our present, which would be, but, you know, depending on how you think about it, their past, and sort of the moment today as well. And also, right, then like that extends into all of the histories and traditions that you're incorporating as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I can only hope.
Yeah. So you shared that you're listening to Little Women right now, but I'm also would love to hear if there's anything else that you're like reading, watching, just like generally enjoying outside of your clay and like studio practice in this moment.
Yeah, great question. Outside of that, I'm just finishing up Miranda July's On All Fours, which is, I recommend as somebody that's aging, as we're all aging in this world, but aging from a feminine perspective, which is really interesting. Other than that, oh my God, I'm just consuming like toddler media right now, and it's absolutely brutal. 100% do not recommend it. I don't. Yeah, that's kind of, I wish I had like something smarter to say, but I'm like, I'm just watching like Miss Rachel with my kid, and it is intense.
Yeah. I have two nieces. Shout out to them. And they live in New York, so I don't see them like all the time. But whenever I'm there, we're definitely, you know, deep in Melania and Bluey and all those worlds. And like my best friend, also shout out to her, her Spotify Wrapped was like half, or not her Spotify Wrapped, her Apple Music replay was like half toddler music. And we were like, you know what? That's great. Like, you know, mad respect.
Absolutely. I'm definitely there, but I'm sure I need book recommendations from you. Like, do you have anything for me?
What are you like, fiction, nonfiction, like around any particular theme?
Fiction phase. Fiction that like really takes me out of reality at this moment.
Okay. I'm getting my phone because I want to get my Storygraph, which is like a Black owned Goodreads, but it's where I like log everything that I'm reading. Some of the books, so okay, a really good book that I read this year was Yellowface. It's like such a ride, but I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Disorientation is like Yellowface, but for academia, which as someone who like just started a PhD program, I was like, okay, I resonate with this.
Mm-hmm.
Homebodies was also really good.
Okay.
That's a Black queer romance.
Okay.
Anything Kennedy Ryan, I love her. Oh gosh, it's the like most recent one that I read was This Could Be Us, but it's the Skyland series. That's also really good.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, Bolu Babalola, Honey and Spice. Like I've been trying to read like one fiction book a month this year. So those are
Oh,
some of my
amazing.
top faves. Also, like You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty is ridiculous from the first line in the best way. Like if you really want to be just like in another world,
Yeah.
that's also like a really good one.
Okay, great. I love it.
Yeah, those are some of my recommendations. But yeah, just to like close, well, first of all, like thank you for coming and chatting with me about, your life and who you are in your work. But do you have anything coming up that you would like to let folks know about? And then also like where can folks go to find more about you and your work?
Yeah. I am shockingly like taking a break right now. I've got like some lectures coming up, but show wise, I'm like taking a little studio break, cleaning out my studio. Thank God it's a hot mess in there, and going to get back to work. But if you want to find out more about me, I have my website, patricereneewashington.com. You can work there.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to link that in the show notes for folks. But I hope that your studio break, both like cleaning it out and also just like not doing anything, is, I'm not even going to say generative. I hope it's just like relaxing and restorative. And then that whenever you do return, you're able to really like be in a flow and make work that you like. And maybe like, right, even from like the test piece, right? Like maybe, you'll take a break and you'll come back and you'll be like, yeah, this test piece, here we go,
That's the energy I
like
need.
despise it. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And I just learned more about my practice talking to other people. So thank you for that opportunity.
Oh, of course. Thank you for sharing and responding to an email from someone that you have never met before. So I'm glad to have chatted, and I look forward to sort of continuing to follow your work and seeing where your practice will go. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to Working Process on your favorite listening platform and find us on Substack for transcripts, photos of guest work, and other offerings.